this is my favorite Fusil sweater that is a little bit too wide to my liking. I'd like to make it more fitted at the waist and at the hips. The first thing I do is turn the sweater inside out and put it back on me. Now I take a handful of safety pins and pinch the fabric at the places where I want to remove it, and then mark each spot with a safety pin. I do it at the waist and I do it at two sides of the hips as well. Then take the sweater off and place it on a table. Place the sweater so that you could see both sides and the stitch patterns are aligned, so that you know that your sides are aligned. See, my ridges over here are aligned and over here as well, so I know the sides are all good. Because I want to make the sweater fitted only at the waist and the hips, I have just four safety pins over here. But if you want to make it slimmer all over along the whole edge of the sweater, then you would add safety pins also at the bust over here, and then you will go all the way along the sleeve and also add safety pins there. If you want just to make your sleeves thinner, then again, when you try the sweater on, put the safety pins at the spots that you want to remove, and then you will work with the sleeve only. But now we are working with the waist and the hips, and the first thing we do, we want to make sure that the distance that we measure over here is the same, because we basically eyeballed it, right, when we placed the safety pins. So we're gonna measure this spot, and over here I have 5 centimeters. And on this side, I have 4. See, this is not the same. So I'm gonna average it and mark 4.5 centimeters. And you use the same logic if you think in inches, so the idea is exactly the same. And we'll need a bunch of pins, just ballpoint pins. So I'm gonna measure 4.5 over here and place a pin here. And then I'm gonna measure 4.5 over here and also place another pin over here. Make sure you don't stretch the fabric too much, because you know it's a knit fabric, so you want to keep it more or less even and not stretched. Okay, here we go. Then we do the same thing for the waist, for the hips. Again, I measure over here, it's 2 centimeters. And what do we have over here? We have 3. That's too much. So the average will be 2.5, and we do the same thing as we did over here at the waist. So I measured 2.5, take a pin and insert it in the fabric. Same here, 2.5. And like I said, if you think in inches, it would be the same concept. 2.5, I insert the pin over here. And if you work with the hips, then make sure the fabric over here is aligned. See, mine is not exactly aligned, so I'm gonna align it over here, then measure 2.5 again, because we want everything to be neat, right? So, and insert 2.5 over here. And now we can remove the safety pins. We don't need them anymore. We already have our pins that are on the same distance from the sides of the fabric. Now we want to mark a line that's gonna be the line where we want the new side edge of the sweater be. And in my case, because I'm not removing anything from the bust, I'm gonna go from this spot and kind of make a nice curve that goes through all these pins. Because it is hard to mark with a chalk or something on a knitted fabric, because it's so the texture is so bulky, I will use pins all the way. So make sure, first of all, that your fabric is nicely aligned, so you don't have like the seam is not on the other side or something like that, or on this side like this, so don't do that. Put it nice and flat, and then use the pins to trace this line. So let's say for me it's gonna be somewhere over here. So I'm gonna place a pin over here, and then here, and then here, and maybe one more over here. And see, because it's pins are easy to remove, let's say over here I see that this one is a little bit it goes a little bit closer to the edge, so I want to change that. So I simply remove it and move it a little bit closer, farther from the edge. And this one is also kind of not straight, so I will change that as well. So it's very easy to correct. Just make sure that the line is approximately straight and it gives you a nice curve. But beware, if you want to make it fitted, like really fitted, close fitting, still don't make the curve too concave. So make sure that it looks kind of natural, because no body looks like this, right? And even though we want to highlight the waist badly, we still have to be careful, because this difference between the size over here and here shouldn't be too big. Okay, and then I do the same thing, tracing the line to the spot where my bust is. So I just insert pins all the way to make that nice line. Okay, let's see what I have here. Yeah, it's pretty straight, so I'm not gonna correct anything. It looks quite nice to me. And now we have to do the same thing on the other edge. And there are two ways to do it. We can either just eyeball it and just trust our instincts, or we can, because the edges are aligned, so we can actually use measuring tape and measure, let's say, from this one, we measure the distance from the edge. It's about 3 centimeters plus the seam. So, and I'm go over here and then I measure, okay, I take away the seam, so it's 3 centimeters. So I'm gonna insert the pin over here. So you can do it this way, or just simply trust your feelings, and because we already have those markers here, and in my case there is no marker, but it is bust over there. So it's not that difficult to make a similar line that is very, very close in shape to the one that we made over here. And here goes the last pin, and let's see what we've got. Okay, maybe this one has to go a little bit over here. See, it's easy to adjust. If you notice that something is not straight, is not even, then it's easy to adjust with the pins. Okay, now it looks pretty good on both sides. I would say they're very similar, so yeah, we are all good. Now what we do, we take a piece of yarn in a contrasting color or in a different color and thread it into a wool needle. So now we're gonna run a stitch over here to keep this marking together, to keep the sweater together along the markings, because then the next step would be to try the sweater on, and it's very hard to try it on with the pins over here. Plus it is also painful if the pin gets stuck in you, right? So to avoid all that a problem, we are gonna simply mark it with the yarn in a contrasting color. And we run the thread. So first of all, we make sure that this edge is aligned, and then we attach the yarn by simply making a couple stitches, leaving a tail, because we're gonna remove it later on, so we don't really worry about the look of it. Just a couple stitches so it stays put, doesn't unravel when we try it on. And then we run this thread at the side of the pins that is closer to the edge of the sweater. So I'm gonna go, see my pin is over here, but I go at this side of the pin. So I simply run a simple running stitch, and as you pass the pins, simply remove them, because see, they catch the yarn and it's not very comfortable to work with the pins in the fabric. So once I made the stitch, I removed the pin and put it aside, and then keep going until you have a nice line, in my case in the red color, right where the markings were. Then I remove the next pin and so on. And because I'm not changing my bust widths, I'm gonna go right into the spot where the bust is, so I'm not gonna make it narrower, just like this. Then make a couple stitches to secure the yarn. Again, no need to worry about the look of it. Just do it like this and trim the tail. And then do the same thing to the other side. So we're gonna run the stitch over here and make a nice red line over here in just a moment. See, I'm holding the fabric underneath because I don't want to stitch it to the rest of the sweater. Well, it's obvious, but sometimes we could just get carried away by the fun part of the process and forget about that. So make sure you are careful. Don't stitch the whole sweater together. That's not the point. Okay, so now I'm almost there, finishing off this second seam and removing the last pin. Here we go. So again, I secure the yarn, just two stitches is enough to keep it put, and trim the tail. Now turn the sweater inside out and back to the right side, and try it on and see how the seam looks. So this is the new future seam of the sweater. See whether it is fitted enough. So I'll see you at the mirror. I'm quite happy with the fit of my sweater right now, and I'm gonna make a permanent seam over here right along this red line. To make a permanent seam, we have several options. First of all, you can do it with a sewing machine if you want to, but make sure that the tension of the yarn is very loose, because what sewing machine often does is stretches the fabric, and that's not what we need. We want to keep the shape nice, but we just want to make it a little bit, to kind of move the side seam a little bit into the fabric. So I usually prefer to do it by hand to avoid that issue with stretch, and you can use any sewing thread in a similar color, or if the color is rare or you don't have a yarn thread in that color, you can use the yarn that you use to make the project and split it into plies. See, mine has 9 plies, so I'm gonna get like 3 of them and thread it into a sewing needle, a big sewing needle, or a slim wool needle. So I have a nice needle like this over here. So I'm gonna thread this 3 plies. See, I splitted the yarn, and I'm gonna use these several plies to make the seam neater, because when we use the whole thread, first, the seam is going to be bulky. Second, you won't be able to insert it into a thinner needle. And we do need a thinner needle because we want to make the seam super secure. We're going to cut out this fabric later on, which is a lot of fun and stress at the same time. So we want to make sure that our sweater stays together. That's why the seam has to be very secure, and we're going to use a thinner needle. Wool needle won't do, unless it is a really thin, skinny wool needle. But otherwise, I strongly recommend to use a simple sewing needle. Just find a needle with a big enough eye over here, so you could insert the yarn, or the plies, or just use a sewing thread. That's totally fine as well. And then just untwist that strand to get those plies, so we could start seaming. Okay, here we go. I released my 3 plies, and I'm gonna put this one aside because I'm gonna use it again. I'll take another 3 plies next time I need to make, to stitch it again, so that the other side of the sweater, or maybe I won't have enough for this seam as well. So we'll see. At least I have this extra yarn that will be easier to unply this time. Okay, now we're going to attach this thread, the yarn, or whatever you're using to the sweater, but we're going to be a little bit proactive. So instead of leaving a tail that we're going to weave in later, we will start by weaving in that tail. And the seam itself is going to happen on this side of this marking. Remember, we run the red line on the other side of the pins. So now we're gonna go back so that the actual seam is happening right where the pins were. This way we make it more accurate. But to attach, before we attach the yarn, we know that we're gonna go this way, so we start from here and split the yarn and run the needle through several stitches over here, like this. This is a simple, quite clever trick that is often used in embroidery actually. So then I pull the thread, see this is my tail, and I'm gonna pull it so that the tail is just peeking out of that spot, and I'm gonna leave it like that. I won't even worry about it later on. And now that the thread and the needle is where I want it, that's when I'm gonna secure it. So I'm gonna make a few stitches like this to make sure that this part of the seam is very secure, because the bottom gets a lot of pulling, right? When we put the sweater on, the bottom is a high traffic spot, so to say. Okay, now we secured the yarn, and we're gonna run the seam in very small stitches. Be very meticulous here, because like I said, this is gonna be a very secure seam, so we need it to be secure. And we do stitch by using the back stitch, not the running stitch this time, because the running stitch is not secure. Back stitch is a much better option. So we go back, see this is my thread, and then I go a little bit to the back and a little bit to the front around that thread, and then I do it again, back and front, and keep going. Keep your stitches really small as you can, and also try to split the stitches whenever you can. So be very careful, because this seam is going to be secure, because like I said, we're going to cut the fabric, and this seam will be the only thing that keeps our sweater together. And it seems that I'm running out of thread right before I finish the seam. That's okay, and that's okay. So I'm gonna just make a couple more stitches until while it is still comfortable to work with this tiny thread, and then I'm gonna secure the yarn, the thread, by doing a couple stitches in the same spot, then go under one stitch, form a loop, and go into that loop and tighten the thread. I'm gonna hide it again, even though you could simply cut it, but you know, to be neat and again secure, I'm gonna hide it going along the seam in the backwards direction, just like this, and trim this little tail, so I don't have to worry about it later on. And now I take that thread again, the one that I already unplied, so I'm going to take the next 3 plies and continue and finish the seam. Now it is much easier to unply, because it's already been unplied once. So I thread it into the needle and continue. And this time I want to hide the tail again to weave it in, so I don't have to worry about it later on. Okay, first I need to find where I stopped. See, this seam, it blends in with the fabric perfectly. You don't even see where it happened. So the only way to see it is to kind of try to stretch the fabric, so you see where the seam happened and where it's not yet there. So I'm going to insert the finger into the fabric inside, and that's where I'm gonna, okay, so here it is. So I feel that over here it is seamed, and over here it's still loose. So my seam ended somewhere over here, and it would be smart to place a pin there, but I wasn't that smart at that time. So now I'm gonna run to this spot, hiding the tail, just as we did at the very beginning of seaming, leaving a little bit of it sticking out. Then I'm gonna secure the yarn with a couple stitches, and then I'm gonna continue and finish the seam. Okay, so I'm all good to go. Make the stitches really tight, because we don't want them to be loose, otherwise the seam will be kind of half open. That doesn't look nice. So make them tight, and make sure you don't get inside this strand, the red one, or whatever color you use, because then it will be hard to remove this strand. And as we're seaming, don't remove it yet. We're gonna need it a little bit later, so keep it there for now, okay? And I'm almost done. Just a couple more stitches, And see here, I made those. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and undo this the strand that I secured. Just undo those couple stitches because they get in the way. I want to make the seam closer to the bust line, and this one gets in the way. So I'm gonna remove couple strands, which is not a big deal. I know I just a moment ago I told you not to unravel that strand, but as long as most of it stays here, like all of it stays here, the very tips of that strand could be undone. Okay, so I'm here. I'm gonna make couple stitches to secure the thread. And again, hide the thread as I still have it in the needle, right? Why do it again later on if I can do it right now and forget about it? Here we go, and trim it. So this seam is done. I leave the red thread in there for now, and now I'm gonna move to the second side and do exactly the same thing. Remember that we make that seam on the side that is closer to the fabric, not closer to the edge. So we're gonna run the seam right here, this side of the red thread, okay? And that's exactly what I'm gonna do right now. I'm gonna hide the tail, then secure the yarn and start backstitching all the way to the bust line. Backstitch actually has another very good property. It is stretchy. So when you stretch the fabric stitched with the backstitch, it's gonna be elastic just as any knitted fabric. So that's a very good stitching to use when you put together your sweaters or any other knitted project. Now when it is time for me to change the thread again, because I'm running out of it, I'm gonna be smarter than I was the last time and insert a pin into that spot right over here, so I know where the seam ended. And now I can secure the yarn, or the thread in this case, and make a knot because we want this seam to be very secure. We don't want it to fall apart. And then I'm gonna hide the tail right inside the seam, like this. And cut this tail. Now I take my last 3 threads, 3 plies that I left from that same piece of yarn, thread it into the needle, and this time I'm not gonna wonder where my seam ended, right? Because I have this pin. So this is a really nice way to make your life easier. So I will run the thread in this direction to hide the tail, make sure that I have a little bit of tail sticking out, and then I secure this yarn and go back seaming. I don't need this pin anymore. It's been very helpful. And as I get closer to my bust line, I see that this red thread is again in my way, so I'm gonna undo this these couple stitches that I made to secure the thread, the yarn, so I could get a clear path to my bust line, to this little point over here. Okay, here we go. The last stitch, so I'm gonna secure this thread and hide the tail right away, so I don't have to come back to this later on. Okay, again, we don't remove the red thread yet, because right now comes the most nerve-wracking part of the process. So this is the time when we're gonna trim this excess fabric, because as you tried it on, you probably noticed already that it creates a lot of bulk, and that's not good. And because the seam itself is absolutely invisible, we don't want to cut the fabric where the seam is. This way we will ruin the sweater. Instead, what we do, we keep this red line here as a marker, basically. So we know the seam is on the other side of the red line. That's how we put it, right? So when we cut the fabric, we leave about 1 centimeter, ½ inch from the seam. We don't want to leave it a lot of it because we don't want that bulk. So what we do, we take scissors, take a deep breath, and relax, because we know the seam is very secure. So I'm not worried at all. So I'm gonna leave about 1 centimeter or so, because I know the seam is on the other side of the red line. So the red line kind of has a little bit in between that line and the seam. So I'm gonna cut it about over here. Just cut it through along the red line. That's why we kept it here. And do it somewhere on a flat surface, because it's gonna get really messy right now. So you'll see. So simply cut along the red line, leaving a little bit of salvages. Just like this. And when we get closer to the former seam, that's okay, we just cut through it. See, this is the excess fabric that I don't need in my seam anymore. And now it's gonna get messy, because now we're gonna kind of take all these little bits out. Don't worry if the fabric gets a little bit closer to the red line. That's okay, because knitted fabric does not unravel from the sides all by itself. It only unravels from the top of the fabric, you know, along the direction of knitting, so it goes back. That's the easiest path for the stitches to drop. But from the side, we are pretty much safe. But we're not gonna leave all this mess like this. We're gonna treat it with an either serger, if you have one, or a zigzag stitch on a sewing machine. This time we are not worried about the extra stretch that sewing machine usually does, because it's not an actual seam, it's just the salvages, right? Or we can just use the regular blanket stitch and treat the edges with the blanket stitch. So I will probably use my sewing machine. But before we get to the sewing machine or serger or whatever we plan to do, we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. So again, we just take the scissors and cut. Just like this. So easy. Stressful, but not difficult at all. And we shouldn't be stressed, because we know that we made that seam super secure, and it's not gonna unravel. And even if it's not super secure, just secure, still it's not gonna unravel, because knitted fabric does not unravel easily from the sides of the fabric. So I'm gonna simply cut it and remove the mess that is right over here. So I'm gonna just remove all those little, not all of them, but you know, at least those that are falling off easily. So I'm gonna just put them aside. And now that we cut through the fabric, we don't need that red line anymore. So we simply remove it. If you accidentally stitch through it, as I probably did over here, see, it doesn't pull out nicely, then just cut it, that's it. And pull it from the other end. Because we don't need to keep this thread, it's just a waste yarn, so don't be shy. If you need to cut it, just cut it. Basically, I'm gonna do it again, so it's easier for me then to undo these 2 stitches that I did over here. Okay, here we go. So now the new seam is more fitted. We tried on the project, so we know it fits well. And it is also quite secure. See, it's really nice. The back stitch, I highly recommend using it in many cases, because it is a very, very nice way to stitch knitted fabric. And now your sweater gets a new life. We'll see in a moment how it fits. And here's my newly fitted Facile sweater. I treated the messy edges with a zigzag stitch on my sewing machine, and then I steamed the new seam so that it lays flat, and now you can see that it is all nice and sleek.